Hello. Thank you all for coming on a very, very peaceful fall evening in Jonesboro. I am Brian Maxson. I'm a professor at East Tennessee State University. I wanted to give a talk today about European history through Appalachian Eyes. Particularly, this will be a lecture about conceptions of the Italian Renaissance, the disconnect between popular conceptions and scholarly perceptions, where some of that disconnect comes from, and then how that impacts our region and how our region interacts with some of those different steps. So a summary. These are some of the major points that I'm going to go over today. The Italian Renaissance did not exist as an historical period. It is a 19th century myth. The myth is how and why that concept enters Appalachia. It has very, very little to do with the actual past itself, and much more about how people in the late 1800s and early 1900s were thinking about the past and the relationship between the United States and the world. So this is a very personal project to me. So I've added a slide. How did I come to this project? I was trained as a historian of the Italian Renaissance. My teaching fields are medieval, Renaissance, and early modern history. So basically Europe from about 1000 up until about 1700. Since 2008, I've worked at ETSU, where I've taught students in Johnson City and from largely around our region about European history during the medieval period, the Renaissance, and the early modern period. And I've published a fair amount on the Italian Renaissance. Over the years, talking with friends in Italy, they would ask me, why do you teach Italian history in East Tennessee? And for them, the root of that question is, nobody is teaching Tennessee history in Italy. I mean, if you go to a university in Italy, you're going to take Italian history. There may be one American history class occasionally, but it's not going to be a focus like here. And so, why do you exist? Was the question. And I never really had an answer for that. Then in 2020, at the very, very start of the COVID pandemic, a friend of mine works at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston. The Massachusetts Historical Society is famous for the papers of John Adams and Abigail Adams and the rest of the Adams family. All of the diaries of John Quincy Adams, in which he details these daily records for years on end, exist in that archive. Also at that archive is a bizarre 15th century speech. This is the sort of thing that I worked on for my dissertation in graduate school. This is a Latin speech delivered in a diplomatic ceremony in Venice in 1469, I believe was the date. This is the only copy of this speech that survives, at least that I've ever seen. It's never been published, and it exists in Boston, Massachusetts, in the same repository where you find the papers of John Adams. And so I was very curious as to why would that be in Boston? If you read, this is very hard to see on the screen, but this is a paragraph written by the original person who purchased it, which you can see written onto the cover here, Samuel Alevin from 1850. What he's written here is this bizarre paragraph about how his text is so many years older than Columbus, and was written during the reigns of, and he mentions the King of England and the King of France. This speech has nothing to do with Columbus, and it has nothing to do with France or England. It has everything to do with Venetian and Italian politics in the 1460s. And so, why would you buy a speech like that, describe it as Columbus, and then why does that end up in a repository like that? So, I was curious. Why does that speech exist? And what is the point of having me teach Italian history or European history to folks in our region? So to get to those answers, I want to talk a bit about what the Italian Renaissance is thought to be and what it now is considered to have been. I can look at my notes there. I don't have to look back. I'm going to try to remember that. Now I can move less. I don't know about all this. One myth is that the Italian Renaissance impacted all major aspects of life for everybody, that this was an epical moment in history. This is within the popular conception, and it simply is not true. There is mountains of literature about the lives of everyday people during this period, the history of women during this period. Their lives are not any different or fundamentally different in 1600 than they were in 1300. There's just many, many more continuity than change. The Italian Renaissance gave birth to modernity in general. When you study this period in history, there's nothing modern about this society. It's a very strange world. The Italian Renaissance gives birth to secularism. This is also deeply problematic. This is not a secular society. Traditionally speaking, when we think about the Italian Renaissance and popular images of it, we would say there was a Renaissance and then there's a Reformation. But I invite you to take a step back and think about that correlation for a moment. A Reformation is entirely about religion, and so what the argument here is that there was a religious medieval period, then this strange secular period, but then we were back to religion again? I mean, that doesn't make a lot of logical sense. And the reason it doesn't make a lot of logical sense is because it's not accurate. The Italian Renaissance gave birth to the individual. If you can define what an individual is, this is also a myth developed in the 1800s. There's plenty of individuals before, and people thinking about themselves and writing about themselves long before Italians are doing this in the 1400s. The Italian Renaissance dispelled a dark age. A dark age is a myth invented in the 19th century to contrast their new modern society of the 1880s and 1890s with a mythical past. Dark age is not a concept that historians use anymore. Or the Italian Renaissance gave birth to democracy, science, and progress. And this is a myth I hear often in my classrooms at the beginning of the term. If you look at what folks are actually interested in the 1300s and the 1400s, it's usually not science. If they are interested in what we would consider science, like STEM, it's because they're interested in a classical text that talked about STEM, not because they're interested in doing some sort of experimental research. That sort of stuff will develop later. Democracy is a modern concept, at least a positive version of democracy. There are some republics, mostly run by oligarchs, but there have been republics run by oligarchs for centuries before the 1300s in Italy. And this last idea of progress, the idea that time is moving forward and that things are getting better as you move forward. This is an idea created during the Enlightenment, during the 1700s and the 1800s. Before that, when people thought of the future, most of the times they would think about it in biblical terms, that in the future will be the return of Christ. And therefore, things are actually getting worse, that you expect them to get worse as the moment of revelation comes. And so we tend not to think of time that way, and that's because of later developments, not this early. So here are some of our myths. I mean, these are two very, very nice pieces of art from the Italian Renaissance. Michelangelo's David symbolizing this focus on human affairs. People had focused on human affairs before. Here's Leonardo da Vinci's The Vitruvian Man, showing you perfection in form. Leonardo da Vinci is a very, very interesting and very innovative writer. But there's lots of interesting and innovative writers also long before Leonardo da Vinci. So what do historians, if the myths that we bring about this period aren't necessarily accurate, what do historians today say about this period of history between the 1300s and the 1500s? Historically, some things did change. I mean, it is very, very possible to identify things as being different in 1500 than they were in 1300. Lives of some people change, governments change, sorts of knowledge changes, absolutely. But for most people, it does not impact them. A lot about this period we would find very unfamiliar. And the examples that I would give you are things like health and things like astronomy. For the most part, people would have believed in the humors of the body, and that maintaining health was about maintaining a balance of the humors in the body. And there's all kinds of things that you can do that. They have preventative measures. They have lots of different objects that you would purchase in order to make sure that the air composition was some way, in order to make sure that you maintain health, that you would move to different places in order to maintain healthy air. I mean, it isn't a society that feels powerless in terms of health, but how they understand the body is so different than how we think about it. With astronomy, this is very much a world that believes that the Earth is at the center of the universe. And the idea that the Earth is a planet orbiting around a sun is going to become popular in the late 1500s and in the 1600s and then continuing on. But in the Italian Renaissance proper, I mean, this is a Ptolemaic system. Ptolemy says the Earth's at the center. There are perfect circles that spiral around it. And it makes logical sense. You can see the sun going around the Earth in the sky, or at least it seems to be. The Bible says that God had the earth, or the sun stop moving around the earth so that his armies could fight longer during the day. And so they have biblical support. They would say they had biblical support. So they have visual evidence, biblical evidence, and then they have logical evidence. They know that heavy items sink. We can tell that from gravity. When you lift something, it falls down. And they know that angels, people who are closer, or things that are closer to God, rise up. And so logically, the earth, which is a corporal or corrupted essence, sinks to the center, and things that are more holy lift up and go higher. And so the earth is at the center because it's corrupt, and God and the heavens are above because they are perfect. Which allows you to have all kinds of things. It makes sense of why does a comet tell us about the future? Because the heavens are perfect, and suddenly they're not perfect. And so that means something in a way that for us, it means something completely different. Or astrology. Today, astrology, I mean, we could talk about astrology. For them, it makes complete sense because with the earth at the center, the heavens have impacts upon this center sphere. Nothing about this period is secular. And this is the example I would show of it. I mean, this is Michelangelo's The Creation of Adam, where God is giving life to Adam. This is painted for the papacy within the Vatican. I mean, this is not a secular image. This is a religious depiction of a religious text. And so to say that this is a period that is prizing secularism doesn't make a lot of sense. The period continued and built on many things. There are some changes like Greek. Greek hadn't been read in Western Europe in a very, very long time. And during the Italian Renaissance, Greek is taught and read and translated for the first time on a large scale since antiquity. And that leads to a lot of changes. It expands the classical corpus, expands the types of ideas that people have to talk about, and there's going to be lots of implications for that later on. But it's a smaller change, not an epical change. There are some changes in political thought, etc. Such a nice painting. So the question I would pose is, so if we have these popular ideas about Renaissance, and we have how specialists now understand the period, why do they become so far out of whack? And that's why I called the slide question mark. So what happens is the very idea that there was a Renaissance that happened on the Italian peninsula during this period it originally was focused exclusively on art and on writing. And it would be that, just like today, if I were to say, I don't know, Cubism, it's a type of art. It has nothing, there's nothing really to talk about beyond that. Or Impressionism, it's a style of art. We wouldn't say that Impressionism, or whatever style of art we want to pick, is a societal changing epic. It's just a change in how people are depicting a painting. And so originally that's how Renaissance was. Renaissance is a style of painting, it's a style of writing. Most people throughout this period, they would have been perfectly content talking about Michelangelo as a Renaissance painter, and they would have said that the story of England starts with the Reformation. The story of Northern Europeans starts with the Reformation. That before 1517 and Martin Luther, or they would, and I'll show you this in a second, they would have a very different idea of when the Reformation starts. But before that, there's no history. There's nothing worth talking about. And you can read these very, very early, these 1700s histories of an earlier period, where the author feels compelled to justify why they bothered to study the pre-Reformation emptiness. Why would you bother to study that when we know history starts only in 1500? Americans, early Americans, would have bought into this completely. The idea that history begins with the Reformation. They would have, in particular, have seen something like this. This is John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was a 14th century Englishman who was interested in reform. These writers in the 1800s in particular would say that John Wycliffe was the start of the Protestant Reformation, and that Martin Luther had built upon the ideas already solidified by the Englishman, John Wycliffe. And the reason that you do that is you want England to have primacy of place, that this story, history, begins in England. Our middle person, this is a man named Giorgio Vasari, who writes in the 1500s a book about the history of art, where he describes Renaissance artistic styles, which is a lot of the origin of some of these ideas. And over here is John Adams himself. John Adams writes a book in the late 1700s where he's trying to defend the American Constitution. And one of the ways that he wants to do that is talk about how this new American Constitution will make an unprecedented type of republic. And he then systematically goes through examples of earlier republics to show how bad they were. And so he talks a lot about Italian history and Italian city republics. But the entire purpose is to show that in this prehistory period, none of these governments were any good. This actual history starts for Adams, too, with the Reformation. Around the mid-1800s, a man named Jakob Burckhardt, and there's a couple of other people alongside him, but Burckhardt is by far the most influential. Burckhardt argues that this Renaissance artistic style actually represents a society-changing epic, that individuals were founded, that for the first time you have individuals appearing during this Renaissance. This idea of secularism comes from Burckhardt. So many of those popular ideas that we have about the Renaissance come from Jakob Burckhardt writing in the 1850s. His ideas have enormous popularity. They get translated into English and get imported into the United States not long after they're published. As the U.S., I've got to make sure I'm not getting lost here. As the U.S. grows as a power in the late 1800s, so here's Burckhardt and here's his book. As the U.S. grows as a power, they take Burckhardt's ideas and build upon it. Because what happens around 1890, so just shortly after Burckhardt is saying, well, this modernity is happening in the Italian peninsula, is the United States is looking for a new story that is not the English story. Because for a long time, somebody like Adams, even though he's a revolutionary hero, he would have seen the American story as intricately tied to the English story, that the American story and the English story are intertwined. Well, as the United States is starting to come to its own in the Spanish-American War, and that's why I've given you images here of the Spanish-American War, and into World War I, the United States wants to have an origin story that is separated out from England. They want to be a rival of England, not just a child of England. And so what Burckhardt offers to them is a chapter in Western civilization. The story of Western civilization that's often taught in college classes is a creation of the United States. It's originated at Columbia around the turn of the century. In the story of Western civilization, the argument is that this unique society is founded in biblical times in the Middle East. Those traditions pass over to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, where they collapse into a dark age. It is only with the Renaissance that the ideas of the classical world are reborn in a new modern society. And in the story of Western civilization, that torch of the Italian Renaissance is passed to the English, and the English then pass the torch on to the United States. And so think about how that narrative works for a moment. If England is saying, we have, our modernity is coming from the Reformation here, probably about 1500. Well, the United States is able to say, yes, we have a chapter of our history that's English, but actually, our history, our origin as a people, as Americans, is much older than yours. It involves these Italians, and it even involves the classical world and stretches all the way back to biblical times. The Italian Renaissance becomes a key chapter, the linchpin in which this Western civilization narrative is professed. Without it, Western civ doesn't work. In short, the U.S. is heir to an older tradition than any competing English story. During the 20th century, and I'll talk about this a bit when I move into the second part of this lecture, which focuses more on Appalachia and how Appalachia fits into this story. But it has lots of twists and turns. And so just a preview to these twists and turns, but what's important to take to this point is the Italian Renaissance as a concept, beyond an artistic style, it just isn't around before the 1800s. And you can read these really fascinating diaries of people on the Grand Tour where they're trying to, so they're before someone like Burckhardt's written, and they love the Italian art they're seeing, and like how they try to talk about it without the Italian Renaissance as a concept is fascinating to see. The concept becomes popular in the United States, largely because of the story of Western civilization in the 1900s, and very, very few specialists today, as the Italian Renaissance was conceived in the 19th century, would defend it. They'd say that's just not how things happened. So this answers some of the questions I started with. Why do I teach old history at ETSU? Almost certainly, my position at ETSU is a holdover from seeing the Italian Renaissance as like a pre-history, a pre-US history. And so although I am a European historian, in many ways I am a pre-US, I fit very much into the American story. That the American story will push it back to the Pilgrims. Before the Pilgrims will be 16th century England, and before that would be the Italian Renaissance. And so you can imagine a regional public school like ours, and like many others around the country, seeing the need to have people who teach 16th century England as well as the Italian Renaissance, in a way that we don't see a need to have somebody studying 15th century Poland, for example, a completely different place. It doesn't have currency in our story. Why does the MHS in Boston have that strange Latin speech? It's because that man's Alabin in 1850, he's buying just a weird collectible. But then the people who buy it after him are seeing it as part of this American story, that this is an object from before Columbus. It is the pre-U.S. history chapter, like the prologue almost. So what does this have to do with Appalachia? Our region participated in all of this. And the earliest and best example of this is this fascinating incunabulum. An incunabulum is a book printed between 1450 and 1500. It's an early printed book. This is the only incunabulum I have found in East Tennessee. It is in Tusculum. It was my colleague, Dr. Tom Lee. I suspect you all know Tom. Tom brought my attention to this, and then the folks at Tusculum were generous enough to let me go and look at it and talk with them about it. This Pliny, it's missing its, I'll show you the image of it. It's missing its, like its front matter. This is the first page of the Pliny, and this is the inside cover of the Pliny, and this is going to be important here in a second. But it doesn't have the actual cover page, and so it doesn't have the year of print. This almost certainly is printed in 1490, I don't remember the exact year. And the reason you're able to pinpoint that is because of what we can piece together about that manuscript, about that incunabulum. I don't know, I have no records that I have seen, and at the time that I talked to them at Tusculum, they didn't know of records regarding it, of the purchase of that and its introduction into the collections. But what probably has happened comes from this coat of arms here. This is a coat of arms of the son of George III. George III, the same king against which the colonies were fighting in the War of Independence of the Revolutionary War. He had a collection of books that spanned 50,000 copies. When he died in the 1840s, his books all went up for sale, and they sold them in multiple spots. Like the first batch of things for sale at auction were his manuscripts, so the handwritten copies that he collected, and his Bibles, because Bible collecting was very, very popular. Then in the second bout, they had all sorts of other sorts of books, including old Latin classics like this one. And so we know this was in that collection, or I can tell you that was in that collection, because this is his coat of arms. You find this same coat of arms in the same, so this, I'm not going to go back to it, the manuscript that I showed you at the MHS, the same people that eventually possessed that book also had books purchased at auction from this exact same sale. And so collectors are scouring these catalogs, buying these in the 1840s. So you can, the auction catalog is available freely online. It's been reproduced, so you can read through it. There probably is a typo in the auction catalog, but I think I located which listing it is in it. The year doesn't quite match up, that I suspect this is and that, but it's listed as a damaged version of Pliny, which is what this almost certainly is. It's like 4 years off. It's not hard to imagine a typo in a catalog of thousands of books. This coat of arms can tell us that this royal purchased this book probably before 1815, because he changes his coats of arms as he gets older, and this is the coat of arms he used up until about that date. So how this gets from its original publication to the royal family 300 years later, I have no idea. And then it's sold at auction. Who bought it? I don't know. I can tell you that around the time that this is going up for sale, Tusculum Academy had a brand new board in charge of it. And this is corresponding with lots of other liberal arts focused colleges in what was then the West, trying to create these bastions of learning outside of the traditional East Coast. And so it's not hard to imagine that you have people on the board of Tusculum who purchase a copy of something like this for the same reasons as you would purchase it for other schools. That this grants cultural legitimacy to the institution, that Pliny, still in 1850, is considered a scientific authority. So that's almost certainly why it is fitting into Tuscany. Make sure I didn't miss anything there. Yep. Other trends that we see in Appalachia. These are buildings at ETSU. This is the building in which I work. This is the building that I have a view of when I teach. When I was teaching this morning, I could look out the window and see Bergen-Dosset. These columns constructed on our buildings here and here are classical flourishes. But they're classical flourishes of people that are looking through that through a prism of a revival of modernity in the Renaissance. So in the 1950s, the 1960s, how do you grant legitimacy to the buildings on a university campus? You install columns to show that this is a modern institution of learning. And I would contrast that. If you go to ETSU's campus today, they're building a brand new academic building. And I invite you to look at the architecture of it and think about how is it showing the world that this is a building where important ideas are being exchanged, that this is a modern institution of learning. And in 2025, these columns are completely gone. It's a completely different vocabulary to the world. Other examples. So I pointed to these twists and turns. In the 1910s and the 1920s, a lot of American scholars began saying that this Italian Renaissance thing is made up. And in many ways, they were right. But they were arguing that this was all made up and that what actually was important was the period before this, that the Renaissance was just an artistic, stylistic movement rather than anything grander than that. When you read through lecture notes from ETSU professors, which exist in the archives of Appalachia from the 1940s, 1950s. I have not been able to read the notes from the 1970s and 80s. I'd like to do that probably in the spring or maybe the summer. But when you read through lecture notes of someone like Morton Brown was hired at ETSU in the 1950s to teach classes like Western civilization or to teach classes like European history. And his notes exist. This is exactly what he is teaching in his introductory class. And you can't read it very well, but here are his notes on what he's going to teach about the Italian Renaissance. And he says explicitly, at one time, this was seen as a really big deal, and it was seen as changing all these things, but now we know it didn't change anything. And so that's where his notes continue. There's actually some of his tests, where one of his questions is, I'm going to get this wrong, but the question is, people used to say the following wrong thing about them, and it's the same exact thing about how people used to say the Renaissance was a big deal, and now we know that it wasn't. I mean, the students had to memorize that fact as they move forward. And that's exactly what's happening in broader scholarship during that period. And a final example I'll give you is a medieval leaf in the Reese Museum. A leaf is a word that we can use for a manuscript image. This. This is off a little bit. It just thanks an ETS student named Seth Lucas who brought this leaf to my attention and then did a little bit of research onto like where it came from and how it entered into the museum. So what I'm going to present here is based upon the work that he did. This leaf comes into the collection. Well, yeah. This leaf comes into the collection in the 1960s. There's a lot of provenance for the Reese Museum for this particular leaf. And it almost certainly is doing exactly the same thing as what this Pliny incunabulum was trying to do for Tusculum in the 1850s. What the columns built onto Bergen-Dosset is trying to do when those buildings are built. This is an opportunity to enhance the tradition that ETSU, that our region fits into a broader American story, which has a prehistory in the Italian Renaissance. when this leaf is bought, it's during the tail end of this period when the Renaissance didn't matter. And so here we have a medieval leaf from the period which does matter. And so to conclude, I just want to talk about the future of the Renaissance in Appalachia and beyond. I don't have time, and I'm not going to, but to talk about the Italian Renaissance as a concept just explodes in popularity in the 1960s. Absolutely explodes. And the reason that we still have Renaissance fairs and countless references to Renaissance art in popular media today is because of this explosion of interest. That's when I entered into ETSU, was at the very, very tail end of that. Over the past 25 years, as that's been revisited, that has largely changed. And you see that change in how people think about the past in a building like the academic building, which is steel and glass, tying into a completely different set of a traditionally different tradition, rather than looking to the past for legitimacy and capital, looking towards other markers of what that, other markers. So, I think that's all I have. That's the end. Thank you. This is still me. I'm the same person I was when I started a half hour, 45 minutes ago. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being here.
Yeah.